Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but in a sterile Manhattan courtroom, my father proved his only loyalty was to the almighty dollar. He stood before the judge, calling me a pathetic, penniless failure seconds before his high-priced lawyer looked at my financial disclosure and audibly choked. To understand the absolute satisfaction of my father's downfall, you have to understand the tyrant he was at the height of his power. My father, Ethan Hayes, was a man who measured human worth strictly by net worth. As the founder of Hayes Freight and Logistics, a mid-sized but highly profitable shipping company based out of New Jersey, he ruled our household like a dictator. He was a man who wore custom Brioni suits to casual Sunday dinners and believed that anyone making less than six figures was fundamentally flawed. That included his own family. My mother, Hannah, was a gentle soul who had married him when they were both young and broke. As Ethan's bank account grew, so did his ego, and eventually, his cruelty. He kept her on a strict allowance, weaponizing his money to control every aspect of her life. And me? I was his greatest disappointment. When I was 18, I told him I wanted to study software engineering and urban development rather than going to law school to protect his corporate interests. His reaction wasn't just anger, it was pure, unadulterated disdain. "You're soft, Fiona." He sneered at me across his massive oak desk, swirling a glass of scotch. "You have no head for real business. You want to play on computers and draw buildings? Fine, but you do it on your own dime. You won't see a single cent of my money." He made good on that promise. I walked out of that house with 2 suitcases, a mountain of student loans waiting for me, and a vow that I would never, ever let a man control me with a checkbook again. For the next 15 years, we didn't speak. I missed my mother terribly, sneaking in phone calls to her when I knew Ethan was out of town on business, but I stayed far away from the toxic blast radius of my father's life. What Ethan didn't know, what he never cared to find out, was that the soft daughter he kicked out was a survivor. My 20s were a grueling blur of 8-0-hour work weeks, ramen noodles, and coding in cramped apartments. I started a boutique prop tech firm that developed an algorithmic model for predicting commercial real estate gentrification. It was niche, but it was revolutionary. By the time I was 30, I had quietly sold my first company and founded a private equity firm, Meridian Capital Partners. I preferred to operate in the shadows. I had a fierce CEO, a brilliant woman named Diane, who acted as the public face of the company while I remained the silent majority shareholder and lead strategist. I liked my quiet, incredibly wealthy life. I wore comfortable clothes, drove a sensible 5-year-old Volvo, and lived in a beautiful, heavily secured townhouse in Brooklyn. Then, my mother died. The grief was suffocating. I attended the funeral, standing in the back, shrouded in a black coat, watching my father play the role of the weeping widower for his business associates. He didn't even look my way. A month later, I received a summons. My mother, in a rare act of defiance before her passing, had left me a seemingly worthless asset. It was a 20-acre plot of undeveloped, rocky land in upstate New York that had belonged to her grandfather. It wasn't worth much on paper, maybe $50,000, but it was entirely in her name, and her will explicitly left it to me. Ethan was furious, not because he wanted the rocky terrain, but because he couldn't stand the idea of losing anything he considered his. Furthermore, Hayes Freight and Logistics was secretly hemorrhaging money. A series of terrible investments and changing supply chain dynamics had left him desperate for capital. He was attempting to secure a massive buyout from a nameless corporate behemoth to save himself from bankruptcy. To Ethan, that 20-acre plot was leverage. He wanted to liquidate every single asset my mother had touched to keep his failing empire afloat. So, he sued me. He filed a motion in probate court to invalidate my mother's will, claiming she wasn't of sound mind and, disgustingly, arguing that I was an estranged, financially unstable opportunist who had manipulated a dying woman. He demanded the land be surrendered to his estate, along with a request that I pay his exorbitant legal fees for the frivolous inconvenience of having to sue his own daughter. When my lawyer, Evelyn Ross, a brilliant, sharp-witted litigator who charged $1,200 an hour and was worth every penny, read the summons. She raised an eyebrow. He claims here that you are unemployed, living in squalor, and reliant on scamming your late mother to survive, Evelyn said, sliding the papers across my kitchen island. I took a sip of my coffee, looking at my father's signature at the bottom of the page. He thinks I'm still the broke 18-year-old he kicked out. He has no idea about Meridian. He has no idea about anything. Evelyn's lips curled into a dangerous smile. Fiona, this land he's fighting you for. Why is he so desperate for it? Because, I replied softly, that worthless 20-acre plot sits directly over the only viable access road for the new mega distribution center being built in that county. Without that land, whoever is building that center can't get zoning approval for their trucks. And do we know who is building that distribution center? Evelyn asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, I smiled. Meridian Capital Partners. And ironically, the logistics company Meridian is currently negotiating to buy out for pennies on the dollar to run that center, is Hayes Freight. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, closing her folder. Oh, Fiona, this is going to be a bloodbath. Shall we let him dig his own grave? Hand him the biggest shovel you can find, I said. The first day of court felt like stepping back into a nightmare I thought I had outgrown. The mahogany-paneled walls of the courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old paper. I sat at the defendant's table, wearing a simple, conservative gray pantsuit. I wore no jewelry, no makeup, and kept my hair tied back in a messy bun. To anyone looking, I appeared exactly as my father described me. A struggling, exhausted woman completely out of her depth. Evelyn sat beside me, equally understated for the day, organizing her files with meticulous, calm precision. The double doors swung open, and Ethan walked in. He looked older, his face lined with stress, but the arrogant swagger was still there. He wore a perfectly tailored navy pinstripe suit, his chin held high as if he owned the courthouse. Beside him was his attorney, Simon Caldwell. Simon was a shark from Harrison and Caldwell, a high-profile firm known for crushing the little guy. He was the kind of lawyer who wore flashy watches, slicked-back hair, and communicated primarily through condescending smirks. Ethan had clearly spent money he didn't have to hire the most aggressive attack dog he could find. As they settled at the plaintiff's table, Ethan shot me a look of pure disgust. He didn't offer a nod of greeting. He didn't acknowledge the loss of his wife or my mother. He simply looked at me like dirt on his shoe. Judge Harriet Vance, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, called the court to order. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Vance began, looking over the docket. Your client is contesting the last will and testament of Hannah Hayes, specifically regarding the transfer of real property to the defendant, Fiona Hayes. Undue influence and financial exploitation? Exactly, Your Honor, Caldwell said, standing up and smoothing his tie. His voice boomed, designed to intimidate. My client's late wife was heavily medicated in her final months. The defendant, who had been entirely absent for over a decade, swooped in at the 11th hour. We have reason to believe Fiona Hayes, who has no steady employment, no assets to her name, and a history of erratic behavior, coerced her mother into signing over this property out of sheer desperation for a payout. I felt my jaw tighten, but Evelyn placed a cool hand over mine under the table. Wait, her touch communicated. Let him talk. Furthermore, Your Honor, Caldwell continued, pacing slightly, we are prepared to show that this property is vital to my client's ongoing business operations. To leave it in the hands of someone so financially illiterate and unstable is not only contrary to the deceased's true wishes, but a gross miscarriage of justice. We are asking for an immediate injunction, reversing the transfer of the deed, and we are requesting that the defendant be held responsible for all court costs, as this defense is clearly frivolous. Judge Vance turned her piercing gaze to us. Miss Ross, does your client have a response? Evelyn stood slowly, projecting an air of absolute calm. Your Honor, we vehemently deny these baseless allegations. My client was deeply close to her mother, and the will was executed legally by an independent notary 3 years prior to Mrs. Hayes's passing, long before any medication was involved. Furthermore, the plaintiff's claims regarding my client's financial instability are entirely fabricated. Ethan scoffed loudly enough to echo in the quiet room. He leaned over and whispered something to Caldwell, who chuckled. Judge Vance slammed her gavel once. Order. Mr. Hayes, you will restrain yourself. She looked back at Evelyn. Miss Ross, the plaintiff has requested a full financial disclosure from your client to prove this alleged motive of destitution. Have you provided it? We are prepared to provide it today, Your Honor, Evelyn said. Caldwell stood up quickly. Your Honor, we object to any redacted or incomplete documents. We want full transparency, bank statements, tax returns, employment records. If the defendant claims she isn't a penniless opportunist, let her prove it. But my client can testify, under oath, to her character and total lack of professional standing. I'll allow it, Judge Vance said. Mr. Hayes, you may take the stand to establish your claims regarding the defendant's background. Ethan practically leapt out of his chair. He took the oath, his hand resting on the Bible, swearing to tell a truth he knew nothing about. As he sat in the witness box, he adjusted his cuffs and looked directly at me. Mr. Hayes, Caldwell began, approaching the stand. Can you describe your daughter's professional life? She doesn't have one, Ethan said, his voice dripping with venom. Fiona has always been lazy. She refused to learn a real trade. She played around with art and computers and expected handouts. When I cut her off to teach her a lesson, she vanished. To my knowledge, she bounces from freelance gig to freelance gig, barely scraping by. So, in your expert opinion as a successful businessman, Caldwell prompted, she would be desperate for money? Absolutely, Ethan stated, leaning forward. She saw her mother was dying, and she saw a piece of land she could pawn off for quick cash. She doesn't understand the value of property. She doesn't understand business. She is a completely financially inept individual who is trying to steal the very land I need to keep my employees paid. He sounded so righteous, so heroic. He was playing the victim perfectly, painting himself as the benevolent job creator being robbed by his deadbeat daughter. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. No further questions, Caldwell said, looking at our table with a triumphant smirk. He thought he had already won. He thought this was a simple case of bulldozing a weak opponent. Evelyn stood up. No questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor. However, regarding the plaintiff's demand for full financial transparency, she picked up a thick, bound folder from our table. It wasn't just a few bank statements. It was a comprehensive, certified financial portfolio. We are happy to submit my client's financial disclosures, Evelyn said, walking forward and handing one copy to the bailiff for the judge and dropping the second copy directly in front of Simon Caldwell. It hit the mahogany table with a heavy, satisfying thud. Unredacted, as requested. Caldwell looked at the folder like it was a minor annoyance. He opened the cover lazily, expecting to find a checking account with a 3-digit balance and a stack of past-due credit card bills. Instead, he was about to look at the audited financials of a woman whose net worth eclipsed his client's by a factor of 50. I watched Caldwell's eyes scan the first page. I watched his brow furrow in confusion. I watched his eyes dart to the name at the top of the page, then down to the bottom line. Then, the color completely drained from his face. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, save for the hum of the HVAC system and the sharp, rapid flipping of heavy paper. Simon Caldwell, the apex predator of Harrison and Caldwell, stared at the first page of my financial disclosure. His perfectly manicured index finger traced the embossed logo of KPMG, the real, globally recognized accounting firm that audited my private holding company. He turned to the second page, which detailed my Tier 1 status at JPMorgan Chase Private Bank. Then, he reached the third page, the Schedule K1S, and the Articles of Incorporation for Meridian Capital Partners, listing my full legal name as the 92% majority shareholder. I watched the exact moment his brain short-circuited. The smug, condescending sneer that had plastered his face all morning completely vanished, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. He stopped breathing for 3 full seconds. A strangled, choking sound escaped his throat, a literal gasp that echoed in the quiet room. He leaned over to his junior associate, a young man named Davis, and shoved the binder toward him, pointing at a specific line item with a violently shaking finger. Davis read it, his eyes widening to the size of saucers, and then both men slowly, simultaneously, turned their heads to stare at me. Is that really her?" Caldwell whispered loudly, the microphone on the plaintiff's table catching the raw panic in his voice. I simply offered him a polite, tight-lipped smile. Ethan, oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated on his side of the room, was still leaning into the microphone from the witness stand, eager to continue his assassination of my character. "As I was saying, Your Honor," Ethan boomed, adjusting his expensive tie, "Fiona is a complete liability. If this court allows her to keep that 20-acre parcel, she'll likely sell it to some local scrapyard for pennies, just to fund whatever bohemian lifestyle she's pretending to live this week. Meanwhile, my company, Hayes Freight, is on the verge of a massive, 9-figure restructuring deal with a major private equity firm. We need that access road. Real jobs are at stake. Real money," Mr. Hayes Caldwell croaked, scrambling to his feet. He looked like he was about to faint. "Your Honor, I must request an immediate, emergency recess. Just 15 minutes, please." Judge Sterling, who had also just been handed a copy of my financials by the bailiff, was currently peering over her reading glasses at the final page. Her eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. She looked at me, then at Caldwell, and a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of her mouth. "Request denied, Mr. Caldwell," the judge said smoothly. "Your client is in the middle of his testimony regarding the defendant's financial incompetence. I find it highly relevant. Please continue, Mr. Hayes. Tell us more about this 9-figure deal." "Gladly," Ethan puffed up, shooting me a triumphant glare. "We are in the final stages of a buyout with Meridian Capital Partners. They are a highly prestigious, aggressive firm. They don't suffer fools, and they certainly wouldn't tolerate an erratic squatter blocking their development plans. Once Meridian acquires Hayes Freight, we will be building the largest logistics hub in the tri-state area." "Ethan!" "Shut up!" Caldwell hissed, abandoning all courtroom decorum. "Stop talking. Now." Ethan recoiled, offended. "Excuse me, Simon? I am paying you to." "You aren't paying me enough to survive this," Caldwell shot back in a frantic whisper, though the acoustics of the room picked it up perfectly. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the plaintiff wishes to withdraw his testimony regarding the defendant's character. We withdraw the motion for financial disclosure." "It's a little late for that, Mr. Caldwell," Evelyn Ross said, standing up gracefully. She smoothed the front of her blazer. "The plaintiff demanded transparency, and we have provided it. Since he is on the stand, Your Honor, I would like to begin my cross-examination." "Proceed, Miss Ross," Judge Sterling said, leaning forward, clearly invested in the unfolding slaughter. Evelyn walked slowly to the center of the room. She didn't carry a notepad. She didn't need one. "Mr. Hayes," Evelyn began, her voice crisp and pleasant. "You've testified under oath that your daughter, Fiona, is entirely devoid of business acumen. Is that correct?" "Yes," Ethan snapped, though he was finally starting to look uncertain, sensing the sheer panic radiating from his lawyer. "And you testified that she bounces from freelance gig to freelance gig?" "To my knowledge, yes." "Mr. Hayes, when was the last time you actually spoke to your daughter, before seeing her in court today?" 15 years ago, Ethan answered defensively. "She walked out. I didn't chase her." "I see," Evelyn nodded. "So your assessment of her financial status is based entirely on an assumption from a decade and a half ago. Let's talk about the present. You just mentioned your company is negotiating a buyout with Meridian Capital Partners, a firm you described as prestigious and not suffering fools, correct?" "Yes. It's a very delicate, high-level negotiation," Ethan said, trying to regain his authority. And who, exactly, are you negotiating with at Meridian, Mr. Hayes? A woman named Diane Russo. She's the CEO. A brilliant woman. A shark. Exactly the kind of business mind my daughter could never comprehend. Evelyn smiled. It was a terrifying, lethal smile. Mr. Hayes, are you aware that Diane Russo, while carrying the title of CEO, is an employee who answers directly to the firm's board of directors and its majority shareholder? I don't see how the internal corporate structure of Meridian is relevant to this probate hearing, Ethan scoffed. Oh, it is incredibly relevant, Evelyn replied, picking up a document from our table. Because, Your Honor, let the record show that I am submitting Exhibit C, the corporate charter and equity distribution records for Meridian Capital Partners, audited by KPMG and verified by the SEC. Evelyn walked over and handed the single sheet of paper directly to Ethan in the witness box. Mr. Hayes, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet tone. Could you please read the name of the founder, lead strategist, and 92% majority owner of Meridian Capital Partners? Ethan took the paper. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the highlighted line. I watched my father's face as 15 years of arrogance, cruelty, and unshakable superiority shattered into a million irreparable pieces. His jaw actually dropped. The paper trembled in his hand, producing a faint, pathetic rattling sound against the wooden rim of the witness stand. He looked at the paper, then up at me, then back at the paper. No, Ethan choked out. It was barely a whisper. This is a fake. This is a forged document. It is heavily certified, Mr. Hayes, Evelyn said coldly. I assure you, it is quite real. Fiona Hayes didn't just walk out and fail, she built an empire that is currently holding your failing company by the throat. The courtroom erupted. Or, at least, the few paralegals, clerks, and gallery members present completely lost their professional composure, murmuring loudly. Judge Sterling didn't even bang her gavel, she just sat back, letting the reality of the situation suffocate my father. This is impossible, Ethan stammered, gripping the edges of the witness stand so hard his knuckles turned white. His face shifted from pale to a dangerous mottled purple. She draws buildings on computers. She doesn't know private equity. Simon, object to this. Object. Caldwell stood up slowly, looking like a man walking to the gallows. Even he sounded like he was asking a question rather than making a statement. Overruled, Judge Sterling snapped. Miss Ross, continue. Thank you, Your Honor, Evelyn said. Mr. Hayes, let's look at the reality of this lawsuit. You sued my client, claiming she manipulated her dying mother out of a 20-acre plot of land for a quick payout. But the truth is, my client's net worth is currently valued at roughly $1.4 billion. Evelyn paused, letting that number hang heavy and absolute in the air. She doesn't need your money, Mr. Hayes, Evelyn continued relentlessly. She doesn't need your land. But you need it. You testified earlier that Hayes Freight is financially distressed. Your company isn't just distressed. It is technically insolvent. You have defaulted on 3 consecutive loans for the Wells Fargo commercial lending, and your operating margins have been in the red for 36 months. That is proprietary corporate information, Ethan yelled, panic finally breaking through his shock. She illegally obtained that. She obtained it during the standard due diligence process, Mr. Hayes, Evelyn corrected him. When you begged Meridian Capital to buy you out, you opened your books to them. To her, she knows exactly how desperate you are. And here is the true tragedy of your situation, Ethan. Evelyn stepped closer to the stand. Hannah Hayes, my client's mother, knew exactly what she was doing. Before she passed, she discovered that your company was failing. She also knew that the only way to save it was to build that new distribution hub, and the only access point was through her grandfather's land. She left that land to Fiona not out of coercion, but as an insurance policy. She knew that one day, you would come begging for it. She gave her daughter the one thing that could stop you. I finally spoke up. My voice was calm, but it carried across the room like cracking ice. She gave me the leash. Ethan, I said, looking him dead in the eye. And today, you handed me the collar. You set me up, he sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at me. You let me spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees to sue you for this land, knowing all along who you were. You sued me, I reminded him simply. I was perfectly content to let you go bankrupt in peace. But you couldn't help yourself. You couldn't let my mother have one final act of autonomy, and you couldn't stand the thought of me having anything. You brought me to court to humiliate me. I stood up from the defendant's table. I looked at Judge Sterling. Your Honor, as the majority shareholder of Meridian Capital Partners, I am officially stating for the public record that as of 10:14 a.m. today, Meridian is formally withdrawing our letter of intent to acquire Hayes Freight and Logistics. We are terminating all negotiations, effectively immediately. Caldwell buried his face in his hands. He knew what that meant. Without the Meridian buyout, the news of the collapse deal would hit the industry wire within the hour. Hayes Freight's creditors would immediately call in their loans. The company wouldn't just restructure, it would be liquidated. You can't do that, Ethan screamed, actually lunging forward against the wooden railing of the witness box. You vindictive little wretch. I am your father. You are destroying my legacy. Your legacy destroyed itself, Ethan, I replied, my voice devoid of any sympathy. You spent your entire life measuring people by their financial worth. Well, by your own metric, look at us now. I own the land. I own the capital. And as of this morning, Hayes Freight is entirely worthless. So, I suppose, are you? Judge Sterling banged her gavel sharply, silencing Ethan as he tried to shout another stream of obscenities. That is enough, the judge commanded, her voice ringing with finality. Mr. Hayes, sit down and be quiet, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Though, frankly, it seems you have much bigger problems waiting for you outside this courtroom. Judge Sterling gathered her papers, looking at Caldwell with a mixture of pity and severe reprimand. The plaintiff's claims of undue influence and financial exploitation are entirely baseless, deeply offensive, and frankly, a spectacular waste of this court's time, Judge Sterling declared. I am dismissing this lawsuit with prejudice. The deed remains with Fiona Hayes. Furthermore, given the glaringly frivolous and malicious nature of this suit, I am ordering the plaintiff, Ethan Hayes, to pay the entirety of the defendant's legal fees. She looked down at Ethan, who had slumped back into the witness chair, staring blankly at the floor. He looked like a deflated balloon, all the bluster and tyranny completely drained out of him. Court is adjourned, Judge Sterling said, striking the gavel one final time. As the bailiff opened the doors, Evelyn packed her briefcase with quiet efficiency. I didn't look back at my father. I didn't need to. I walked out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors closing behind me, sealing Ethan Hayes inside the tomb he had spent 15 years digging for himself. The fallout was not merely a local scandal. It was a spectacular, highly publicized corporate implosion. By the time Evelyn and I had reached the ground floor of the courthouse and stepped out into the crisp autumn air of Manhattan, the news had already hit the Bloomberg terminals. In the world of high finance, a collapsed nine-figure acquisition doesn't stay quiet for more than a few minutes. Meridian Capital Partners had formally filed the withdrawal of our letter of intent with the SEC, citing irreconcilable discrepancies discovered during final due diligence. We didn't need to elaborate. The silence spoke volumes, and the sharks immediately smelled blood in the water. Within 2 hours, Hayes Freight and Logistics was in a freefall. My father's major creditors, led by Garrison Commercial Banking, had been patiently waiting for the Meridian buyout to finalize so they could recoup their millions. The moment the deal died, their patience evaporated. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, Garrison issued a formal notice of default. By the following morning, 2 other major logistics suppliers filed emergency motions to freeze Hayes Freight's operating accounts. My father's empire, built on decades of ruthless intimidation and leveraged debt, crumbled in exactly 48 hours. For the first week, I completely insulated myself. I instructed Diane Russo, my CEO at Meridian, to handle all inquiries with our standard, impenetrable corporate PR responses. But behind the heavy oak doors of his suddenly empty corporate headquarters in New Jersey, Ethan Hayes was experiencing a level of panic he had never known. The man who had mocked my freelance gigs and bohemian lifestyle was now legally barred from accessing his own company's checking accounts. Then came the phone calls. First, they were directed to Evelyn's office, angry, blustering voicemails from Simon Caldwell, demanding some sort of settlement, threatening countersuits for bad faith negotiations. Evelyn simply forwarded them to our legal department with a sticky note that read, "File under comedy." When the legal threats failed, my father tried to reach me directly. He called my old cell phone number, the one he hadn't dialed in 15 years. He bypassed my assistants and somehow found the direct line to my private office at Meridian. I let it ring. Finally, 3 weeks after the court date, a sleek black town car pulled up outside my townhouse in Brooklyn. I was sitting on my front steps, drinking a cup of black coffee and reviewing structural blueprints on my tablet, wearing faded jeans and a heavy wool sweater. Ethan stepped out of the car. The transformation in just 21 days was jarring. The custom Brioni suit hung loosely on his frame. His posture, usually rigid with unwarranted superiority, was slightly hunched. The arrogance had been entirely carved out of his face, replaced by a deep, hollow desperation. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like an old, tired man. "Fiona," he said, his voice raspy. I didn't invite him inside. I didn't stand up. I simply took a sip of my coffee. "Ethan, you're trespassing on a residential street. I have security cameras, and I will call the police. Please." He held up a hand, a gesture of surrender. "Just 5 minutes. Please." I gestured to the sidewalk. He swallowed hard, looking at the multi-million-dollar brownstone behind me, finally grasping the reality of the wealth I had built without a single dime of his money. "The board forced me out yesterday," he said, his eyes dropping to the pavement. "Hayes Freight is going into Chapter 11 receivership. They're going to liquidate everything. The trucks, the warehouses, the intellectual property. Everything I built." I read the filings. I replied coldly. "Garrison Banking is taking the lion's share. It's a standard liquidation. You can stop it," he pleaded, taking a step closer. The desperation in his eyes was sickening. "Meridian has the capital. You could step in as a white knight, buy the debt, restructure the company under your umbrella. You own the access road now. The distribution center can still be built. We could do it together. As a family." I actually laughed. It was a short, humorless sound that seemed to physically strike him. "Family?" I echoed, setting my coffee cup down. 15 years ago, you told me I was dead to you because I wouldn't be your corporate puppet. A month ago, you stood under oath and tried to convince a judge I was a manipulative, penniless thief who conned a dying woman. You didn't want a family, Ethan. You wanted subordinates. And the second you realized I wasn't one, you tried to destroy me. "I was wrong," he cried out, his voice cracking. "I was a fool, Fiona. I see that now. You proved me wrong. You're brilliant. You're everything I ever wanted you to be. Don't let my legacy be sold off for scrap." "It isn't your legacy anymore," I told him, my voice dropping to a whisper of absolute finality. "And for the record, I am stepping in. But not to save you." He blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "Meridian Capital isn't buying your debt, Ethan. We are waiting for the bankruptcy auction next month. Once your company is completely dissolved, Meridian is going to purchase the physical assets, the trucks, and the warehouses for pennies on the dollar from the receivership." I watched the color drain from his face as the realization hit him. "We are going to build the distribution center," I continued smoothly. "We are going to use the access road on my mother's land, but the company won't be called Hayes Freight. We are rebranding the entire fleet. Your name is being erased from the industry entirely. You get nothing. Not a buyout, not a board seat, not a cent." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The absolute finality of his ruin had finally anchored itself in his mind. "You are just as ruthless as I am," he finally whispered, tears of pure bitterness welling in his eyes. "No," I corrected him, picking up my tablet and standing up. "I build things. You only know how to leverage them. Goodbye, Ethan. Don't ever come to my home again." I turned and walked through my front door, the heavy locks clicking into place behind me. The hard karma played out exactly as I promised. 6 months later, Meridian Capital successfully acquired the liquidated assets of his former empire at a fraction of their original valuation. We broke ground on the new distribution hub in upstate New York. The sprawling, state-of-the-art facility brought hundreds of high-paying jobs to the county. The 20-acre plot my mother left me was paved over to create a grand, tree-lined avenue leading directly to the facility's main gates. I legally named it Hannah's Way. As for Ethan, the bankruptcy wiped out his personal wealth, which had been dangerously intertwined with the company's leveraged assets. He lost the sprawling estate in New Jersey. He lost the country club memberships. He was forced to move into a modest, two-bedroom apartment in a dreary suburb, living off a highly restricted fixed income. He now lives the exact life he spent decades mocking and despising. He is utterly irrelevant, entirely forgotten by the business world, and completely cut off from the daughter he threw away. I never spoke to him again, choosing instead to live my life in quiet, unshakable peace. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a quiet paper trail and a perfectly timed revelation. My father worshipped wealth above his own flesh and blood, ultimately losing both. I didn't destroy his empire. His own arrogance did. Now, my mother's legacy stands strong, proving that true power isn't about controlling others, it's about knowing your worth when the world insists you have none.